And how do we get grace? Well, one of the main ways of getting grace is by prayer and praying, because God is always eager to hear our prayers. But before I deal with that, which I will do, in fact, in the next conference, I just want to say a final word this time about Rancé's life, about La Trappe, and about the monks of La Trappe. There were problems. Rancé, as you know now from what I told you, had a very strict vegetarian diet, and in modern terms, it was a diet which was highly deficient in protein. And the consequence of this diet was that the mortality at La Trappe, in the early days especially, was quite astonishing. And it was known to be astonishing both inside and outside the abbey. The public had heard about the really wicked, terrible mortality among the monks of La Trappe, and they wanted to know what was going on, and they were concerned about it. Rancé's answer was clearly and absolutely logical, and it came in fact from the Desert Fathers, not so much from Benedict, namely that a monk's business was not to live, but to die. And he actually could quote Bernard on this, that, a monk is, when you get sick, you don't consult physicians, you die. That's what your business is to do. Your monastery, said Bernard and said Rancé, the monastery is a tomb. And once you go in a tomb, you don't expect to crawl out of the tomb on all possible occasions. Your tomb is there for you, and you die in it. So the business of a monk or nun, the business of a religious, is to die for God, to imitate their master, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for the human race. Death is the imitation of Christ. This too can lead to unfortunate logical consequences. So for the monks of La Trappe, if they were sick, one physician's assistance was strongly dissuaded. They didn't want that at all. But the other side of the coin is, as we can read in the several volumes of the relations, the relation of the lives and especially deaths of the monks of La Trappe, the monks themselves were perfectly willing and eager to accept it. And the relations, the relation, which relate the elevating deathbeds, scenes of the monks of La Trappe, indicate that many of them, dying in extremely painful circumstances, to some extent because of serious protein deficiency, sometimes because of wounds inflicted on themselves when they were working in the fields, gangrenous sores, all this sort of stuff. And and Rancé was with them. He was with them when they were there. He saw them through their last agonies. And the thing that is also becomes absolutely clear in the relation is that they absolutely loved their abbot. And that Rancé, for all his severity, you've come here to die, and die you will, for all this, he absolutely adored them. There was a real, deep, unmistakable, unquestionable love between Rancé and his monks. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. So much so that despite what people knew was the hard life of La Trappe, more and more monks wanted to come there. They were almost, especially after Rancé's death, they were sort of queuing up at the door to come in. Now, not all of them stayed, you understand. But there was this attraction for this abbey and for this abbot who clearly loved his monks and would be with them on all possible occasions. He would offer them his help, his consolation. If they had a problem, he would invite them to come and discuss it with them. Sometimes, as I said, in the matter of humiliation, sometimes in things like the so-called chapter of faults, there are grave dangers involved. But above all, there was the unmistakable and undoubted love he had for these monks. And the fact that he had a real gift as a spiritual director. And we can see this too, not only in the monks of La Trappe, not only in the nuns of the Trappist abbeys associated with it, les clercs, but in the world outside as well. In a later lecture, we'll be coming across a woman who was associated with the royal court, a very, very proud and haughty woman. And only Rancé could have told this extremely proud and haughty woman, who was so very highly conscious of her position, that the way in which she would make any progress in the spiritual path was because she was too proud. Only Rancé could have done that without having his head beaten off with her umbrella. There's no question about it. But he had this power to see into the hearts of people and to be able to discern where they were, what the problems was, and sometimes what they needed. Sometimes, as always, he would make an error, but he had undoubtedly this possibility. And as I said, one of the things that comes out in the stories of La Trappe is how much the monks loved him. And therefore, of course, I mentioned in an earlier conference how many people wished to make the arduous, I repeat, arduous journey to La Trappe, which needed a guide, in order to witness it for themselves. James I, in exile from England, went to La Trappe, the king, and was fascinated by what he saw, just absolutely intrigued by what he saw. People were riveted by La Trappe. In the book by Daniel Larocque, the one that brings out the rumour of Madame de Montbazon's head separated because of the too short coffin, what also becomes clear is how much people were talking about the abbot of La Trappe, about this remarkable conversion that he had undergone. And remember, at this time, it's the 17th century. The 17th century is a time when life is public. Life is infinitely more public than it is now. Like in Versailles, the great palace of Versailles, there was one toilet. And people lived lives in public, particularly the aristocracy. And the higher the aristocracy, the less private was your life. And when there were these great conversions, the great conversions they were public conversions. You didn't just convert privately in your own bedchamber. You converted in public and made sure everybody knew it. These were the great grand gestures of what was known as the great century, the grand siècle. Everything was on the big screen. And Rancé's conversion was only one of many such conversions. Some were even more dramatic than that of Rancé, one of the mistresses of Louis's mistress, the king's mistresses, converted and became, in fact, a nun. And that too was a huge public event. So that was the nature of things there. And people were fascinated by this public conversion of this well-to-do aristocratic figure who had now become the most austere and ascetic of people, living in this wilderness of La Trappe, in, generally speaking, absolute silence, because, of course, silence was observed there all the time, eating a minuscule diet, working in the fields, dying regularly in large numbers. What is going on? They wanted to know. What is it that's going on here? And as I mentioned earlier, one of the problems was keeping the voyeurs at bay, keeping the visitors limited. And happily for Rancé and his monks, La Trappe was so difficult to get to that it did, in fact, put many people who would otherwise have visited, put it off. He himself followed the his own ascetic rules. There's no question about it whatsoever. And his labours, his arduous labours with his monks, his concern for his monks, and also his incessant problems with the world outside, the controversies over humiliations, the controversy with Innocent de Masson over the Carthusians, the controversy with Mabillon over the question of monastic studies, took it out of him. It took it out of him. And the continual labours and this ardent, and I have to say overdone asceticism at La Trappe, with this, and I have to say again, inadequate diet took its toll. And by 1694, he's coming to the end of his life now. He was born in 26, remember. By 1694, he was suffering severely. Suffering from what? Well, you will not be surprised to hear that gastric problems were one of them, rather like Bernard of Clairvaux, who also, for the same reasons, was suffering from gastric problems. And also when he was, it was either rheumatism or severe rheumatoid arthritis. I'm not quite sure which, but some sort of rheumatism. And his legs were so swollen that he could hardly walk, and his right hand had become so swollen that he couldn't even sign his name. And he was in continual pain. He couldn't walk without assistance, and he had no choice but to enter the infirmary at La Trappe. Had no choice in the matter. And in May of the following year, that's May in 1695, he resigned as abbot. And he lived on till 1700, and he lived on to see three successors. The first, I won't go into I won't bother, I'll just went through them. Dom Zozim Fazil was his first one, but he died unexpectedly, very suddenly and unexpectedly, a short time later, actually in just March in 1696. And the second was the most interesting man, Dom Armand Francois Gervais, who was an erratic and turbulent monk. Actually, he deserves a biography to himself, a very odd man who was forced to resign. He was forced out in 1698. And the third was Dom Jacques de la Cour, who became abbot in 1699 and who succeeded and who survived Rancé and was actually with Rancé when Rancé died. And death claimed the abbot of La Trappe we know exactly when, between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, the 27th of October in 1700. We have a detailed description of his deathbed by the bishop of the local diocese, who was a friend of his and knew him very, very well indeed, left us a record of his last hours. He was lucid until his very last moment, and when he died, he was 74 years old. And so we commend him to the God whom we worship so devoutly. And at the next conference we will talk about how our prayers and how his prayers were received by the God to whom he prayed. Next time, prayer and praying, according to Armand de Rancé, on whom be peace.